We live in a day and age when it is very easy to be overwhelmed by all of our responsibilities. Especially maybe if you are parents of children. Think of all the different things that you are involved with. And I hear parents talk about it all the time. You've probably heard it, right? We run a taxi service. And that's how it is when you're raising your children. Not to mention the fact that you still have to go to work. And then somebody has to mow the yard, and somebody has to take out the trash, and every now and then you have to vacuum the carpets, and that stack of dishes just keeps piling up. We get overwhelmed by responsibility. Then you put all of that on top of that, and we now have so many people who feel responsible to social media. I got to put it everywhere. We had a first yesterday. I thought it was cool. It's way outside of my pay grade. But just as I pronounced Lee and Katie to be married, without Lee knowing it, Katie had arranged that all the bridesmaids and she pulled out their phones and she updated her Facebook status right there. I'm talking, that is, I got to let people know right now. You see, the weight and the burden of responsibilities hits us at every turn. We come in our Sunday morning summer sermon series to ask the question, how much do you weigh the burden of responsibility? I take it for granted that most everyone here is a rather responsible person, and therefore you have a lot of responsibilities. There are people who are overwhelmed by that. And sometimes they throw up their hands and they want to quit because I just can't keep doing all of this. There are various factors that lead them to having all of these responsibilities. Not all of them are good. Some people are overwhelmed with responsibilities because they're after more and more money. And so they get more and more jobs, and they become more and more responsible in those jobs. There are others that do it because they're rising the corporate ladder just for the status of it all. There are others that are trying to keep up with neighbors. There are others that have all these selfish ambitions. Whatever it is, we are people, many of us, who feel at times that we are burdened over much by responsibility. If you come here today feeling that weight, you need to know that you're not the only person. In fact, one of the great men of Scripture felt that burden. In 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul began about verse 22 to list all of the things that he was going through to preach the gospel. He listed all of the beatings and the persecutions and the imprisonments. He mentioned the times that he was shipwrecked, the times that he didn't have food, the times that he was cold, the times that friends had abandoned him. And he mentioned all of these things, and then he comes to verse 28 and he says this, and besides all that, my deep concern for all the churches. I think I see Paul looking at his life and saying, I have some big responsibilities, and I'm feeling this weight, and I'm feeling this burden, because you know what he says the next verse, verse 29? Who is weak? And I am not weak. He's not saying he's not weak. In fact, he's saying it the opposite. If you're weak, I'm more than that. I don't have the ability to do with my own strength the responsibilities I have to do. I have all of this on my back. I'm bearing all of this on my shoulders. It is a weight, it is a burden, and maybe today you're carrying it. I know there are many who are. Let's think about it for just a few minutes. The text before us in Luke chapter 12, if you want to turn there, you can walk with me through this text to see what Jesus said about responsibility. We begin with the first two verses understanding this. Every person recognizes the burden of responsibility. Every person does. See, there are words that everybody uses. You use them, I use them, people in the world, those who don't even have a thought about God, they recognize the burden of responsibilities because we use words like this: should, ought, must. Right? Everybody has this concept in their minds that we have a responsibility. I ought to, you must. It's an absolute necessity. Now, the concept of responsibility is obvious in our country by laws. The concept of law grows out of the concept of responsibility. Because we have a responsibility, we're going to make a law. So everybody recognizes the burden of responsibility. I want to ask a question. I'm not going to answer it till the end. I'll ask it this way first. Is it valid? Is it valid to say that we have responsibilities, ought, must, should? Are laws valid? I'll ask it secondly this way. If so, where does the validity of responsibility come from? Everybody recognizes it. Everybody uses it. Everybody says it. They all use those words. We all make laws. How then do people recognize that it is a valid thing to make somebody responsible? We will table that for a moment. Let's continue with this text. The second thing I want us to understand is, when we talk about the burden of responsibility, this text tells me you be a responsible person. Here's this man. He had come to Jesus and he said, "Tell my brother." Those are the words of responsibility. Why did the brother have Jesus get involved in the first place? Because he felt that there was some responsibility on his brother's part. And he said, "You tell him to divide that inheritance with me." There is a program on Investigation Discovery Channel, ID, and it's called Behind Mansion Walls. And it mostly talks about people who have either been murdered or who are missing, and almost all of them are family members who are arguing over inheritance money. That's where it comes down to almost every time. The money angle is there. That's what's going on here. You have a responsibility. Tell him to do it. Tell him to do what he ought to be doing. And then Jesus says in verse 15, two things. He says, you need to be a responsible person. He looks to his disciples and he's using this opportunity. Be responsible. He describes responsibility having two parts. Number one, there is a stewardship part. Take heed and beware. Responsibility, a responsible person must understand that responsibility involves stewardship. That is, taking care of something. It is managing something that has been put into your trust. That's what it means to be a steward. Somebody challenges you and says, here is what I'm giving you to do. This is your job. I want you to take it over. I want you to be a steward of it. Paul comes along in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 1. He says, it is required in a steward that a man be faithful. Now, responsibility is stewardship, and stewardship demands faithfulness. Beware and take heed. You better watch it. Covetousness is on the horizon. There is a burden of responsibility that Jesus put on these people. And his burden was stewardship. You better beware and you better take heed. Number 2, responsibility involves accountability. And Jesus put the burden right on these people. He goes on to say, your life does not consist in the abundance of the things you possess. Accountability. You see, Jesus brought this discussion right into the mainstream, and he said, this is not what life is about. Let's be accountable. This is not how things ought to be. Fighting over this money. Yes, there is a burden to responsibility. And the burden is to give an account of the life that you are living. This is not it. And that accountability, the key is personal. Galatians 6 verse 5. Everyone shall bear his own burden. Jesus tells us that responsibility is a part of life. And in this story about this man, he is laying the burden of responsibility on these people. And he is saying, you be a responsible person. You practice stewardship. You manage what you've been given faithfully. And then you give an account to how you've been managing it. And assess your life personally. So we see that the burden of responsibility rests upon us. Jesus wants us to know you need to be a responsible person. So we're not saying that the burden of responsibility means that we need to get out from under responsibility. That's not what it means. Because in effect, you can't. None of us can rid ourselves fully of responsibility. So then comes the question. If I am weighed down by the burden of responsibility, how do I manage it? How do I take care of it? How do I do it? The story that Jesus tells provides us opportunity to understand that responsibility has 3 directions for us to account. I also want you to look at 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 10. Listen to this verse. As each one has received a gift, minister it to one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Let's take that verse and combine it with this story and understand how to manage the burden of responsibility. Number 1, fulfill your responsibility to yourself. If you are burdened with this responsibility, if you feel like it is a weight, the thing we have to do is back up and examine it properly and learn how to handle it. Number one, you fulfill the responsibility you have to yourself. This man planted in his fields, and he had barns, and the fields produced so much that he didn't have enough barn space. So he said, I'm going to tear them down and build bigger barns. And then his words were, and I will say to my soul, eat, drink, and be merry. And Jesus said, you are a fool. You have a responsibility to yourself. There is a personal thing involved here. What did the text of 1 Peter say? As each one has received a gift, you and I have gifts. We have talents. We have abilities. And the very existence of those demands that we be responsible with them. And as we are being responsible to ourselves. It was told to Timothy this way by Paul. 1 Timothy 6, verse 20, guard what has been committed to you. 2 Timothy 1, verse 14, keep what has been given to your trust. Here's what those words mean. Stand on guard and watch. Timothy, you have a responsibility to yourself. You've been given these things. Now you stand on guard and you watch over them and you manage them and you do what you ought to do. In other words, evaluate. There is nothing wrong with looking at yourself and saying, I can do this. You don't have to say it in a bragging way, an arrogant way, a conceited way, but to say that I can do this and then do it, that is what responsibility is all about. I'm managing what I have, and I'm calling myself into account by doing it. That's what we ought to do. But there's also nothing wrong with saying, now, this is something I just can't do. The caution is this. Don't underestimate intentionally your abilities and talents just to get out of work. We tried that when we were little, right? I can't do it. I spend a lot of time reliving that through my grandson. But I can't. Yes, you can. I've seen you do it a number of times. But you gotta help me. No, I'm helping you by helping you do it. Why doesn't he want to do it? Lazy. Just like all of us were or are. Be responsible to yourself. Know what you can do and then do it. Number two. In managing and taking care of this weight of responsibility, this text shows me that I have a responsibility to other people. Why did Jesus condemn him as a fool? It is sort of between the lines. Why did you tear down your barns and hoard? Why not take the leftovers and give it to those who need them? The burden of responsibility involves other people. as we have received the gift, 1 Peter 4, verse 10, minister to one another. Now, as we are managing the burden of responsibility, let us not think that we can get out from under the responsibilities we have to other people and thereby relieve ourselves of this burden. That's not what it's about. We're stepping back and saying, I can't stop helping others. I can't stop being a part of other people's lives. I still have a responsibility to them. So as I'm feeling this weight of responsibility, don't take people out of the equation. Number 3, I have a responsibility to my God. Who called him into account? The Lord did. Tonight your soul will be required of you. Then whose will these things be that you have provided? He had a responsibility to act in a way he should because God is who God is. Now we're ready to answer the question. Why is responsibility valid? Why should people treat each other well? Why is it right to have a law that says you can't break into somebody else's house? Because God is. Well, that has nothing to do with it. It's because we have a community and because we want to live in a way that is safe and right. If there is no God, here's what I think. If there is no God, then I am God. And you are God. And in fact, if there is no life after this life, if this is the only life we have and there is no God, if I want your TV in order to enjoy this life, since this is all there is, then my responsibility is to go get your TV. Why should I be concerned about the community? Why should I be concerned about anything except me if there is no God? But since there is a God, now I'm concerned about you. And now I'm concerned about me. And as I feel this weight and burden of responsibility, I gladly should be responsible to myself and to others and then to God. But then finally, take time to rest. Mark chapter 6 and Mark chapter 7. Two different occasions. Jesus, in Mark 6, took his disciples to a deserted place to get away from people. In Mark chapter 7, Jesus, the Bible says, went to a house hoping that no one would know it. Now, one person might say, well, wait a minute. That time that Jesus was sitting in that house away from people, and when he was sitting out in the desert trying not to be found, he should have been preaching the gospel. He should have been healing the sick. He was not fulfilling his duty because he was sitting down doing nothing. Oh, that's the opposite of truth. Why do you think Scripture recorded that Jesus rested? For the purpose of telling us we need to rest. I suspect that there are a lot of people who are burdened and weighted down by responsibility because they don't take time to rest. And it's not lazy to rest. It's valuable. It is necessary. If you are weighted down and believe that people are piling responsibilities on you right and left and you can't avoid it, here is the point of this lesson. You take all those responsibilities and evaluate. I'm going to be responsible to myself and to others and to God. And that's how I'm going to manage all of them. And then I'm going to set aside those that don't fit, those that I don't need to do right now. And there are times that I'm going to rest and stop and just calm down. And when I do that, when I am responsible in the ways that I should be and don't take on any more than is required of me, God doesn't expect me to do more than I can do. I have talents. He gave them to me. He also doesn't expect me to set them aside and not use them. But as we are balancing and bearing the weight of responsibility, when you evaluate those three directions, do what you can do, and then take time to rest and settle down and commune with yourself away from responsibility. Rest is your responsibility so you can handle your other responsibilities. That's Bible. That's what Jesus wants. That's what we need to do. I think it is interesting that the Bible presents heaven with the word rest. The faithful, their works follow them, and they have rest. Revelation chapter 2. The Hebrew writer in chapters 3 and 4 talks about the rest that is available. It's a rest away from the barrage of Satan and a rest from having served the Lord faithfully. Today, the Lord wants to help you fulfill your responsibilities as you are responsible to Him. And give your life to Him and let Him take control. When you are baptized into Jesus, He becomes your responsibility. And then He will help you with all the things that life has. Today, if you need help with the burden, be responsible before God and to yourself. Let us help you if you need as we stand.